My uncle owns property just outside of Lubbock, Texas, and I've gone hunting up there several times. My uncle calls me up and tells me I need to come out here and that all the doe are being killed off all of a sudden. Confused, I asked him if it could have been coyotes or a cougar. He just told me I need to come out here and see this for myself, that nothing kills like this. This confused me even more, so I went out to his property, brought some of my own equipment like my binoculars and my rifle. My uncle only lives about an hour away from me, so it wasn't a long trip. I guess he used to have a bunch of deer that would traverse through his 12 acres of property and eat on the salt blocks that he would leave out. Yesterday morning, he got up and noticed that they were nowhere to be found, which is very unusual since there's always doe walking around. There's usually at least 40, if not more, visible on sight. Earlier this morning, he trekked through the woods a little ways and found many doe torn to shreds and mutilated. He was telling me he saw at least 15 plus fawns to doe ripped and shredded to pieces. Unless there's a herd of cougar that had just moved in the area all of a sudden, nothing kills that many doe. He told me that there was still a lot of meat on all these animals, but it didn't look like they were killed and eaten on, just killed and then ripped up. I had to see this for myself. I got all geared up and traversed a little bit out on his property. I could smell the blood and the death. After the initial clearing, there were several dead doe just in my line of sight. Well, they were more like piles of gore, fur, and skin than an actual corpse of a deer. The smell was coming downwind, so my nostrils were assaulted by this putrefaction. I probably spent around 30 or so minutes scouting the property, seeing the copious amounts of piles of gore all throughout. The only thing I was able to track was a multitude of large canine-like tracks. These tracks were much larger than typical canine tracks. These were easily double the size of a wolf's track. There was long hair found throughout on the ground in large, stringy clumps. I wasn't sure what to make of all of this. I've never seen this happen in my life. What was great about my uncle's property is because of all the doe in the area, it would bring in the big bucks come hunting season, and we always were able to get a buck because of it. Bucks can get stupid, just like us guys can chasing tail, and sometimes they'll make themselves even more vulnerable to chase these doe, leaving themselves out in the open. But that's besides the point. During my investigation, I didn't see any antlers or any evidence that would point to any dead bucks. This was in June, so I don't think there are any bucks in the area at the time. I only saw fawns and doe. I brought some of the hair back to my uncle, who thought it was strange, but nothing came of it. The doe started coming back to the area months later. He and I think it was a herd of something that came through the area and tore these animals up. Maybe a group of wolves, but we're not sure. Was working at my construction site late into the night, getting some tools out of my truck when the most horrific roar came from the woods surrounding the site. A few of us on the night crew stopped, looked around, and then at each other and shrugged. We were spooked, but we had a job to do. We weren't going to let some silly noises stop us. We continued doing our night crew work, and things went as normal for the next few hours. We actually forgot about the roar until we heard some banging and clanging out by our work trucks. Since I was the supervisor on shift, I thought a couple things. One of our crew members was banging around, destroying things, or could have needed help. Or two, somebody was trying to steal our shit. I paced on over to where my work truck is, and as I'm about 20 feet away from my truck, out pops this horrible looking face from behind the bed of the truck. I stopped in my tracks. This shape stood up to tower over the bed of the truck. It looked down into the bed and reached to pick up what looked to be a dead animal from the bed of the truck. If I had to guess, maybe a small deer, and then looked right back at me, turned around and walked off into the night. Had I just seen a werewolf in the living flesh? Those teeth, and that face. I was stunned for a few moments, not sure what the hell just happened. I felt like I was living in a dream in that very moment. These kinds of things don't exist in reality. So what the hell did I just see? Its teeth really stuck out to me, no pun intended. It bothered me. Nothing should have that many teeth. It was like looking into the mouth of a shark. So many teeth, all razor bladed. I knew those teeth were meant to shred meat to pieces. After a moment, I slowly walked back to my workers where they were laughing at me, joking what all that banging was. I was pale as a ghost, and apparently because they were asking me why I was so white. Did I see a ghost? Did I get scared of working out at nighttime? I just ignored it and just told them to keep working and drop it. Since we were doing the night crew thing that night, we left when the morning crew arrived later that morning as the sun rose. As I made my way back to my truck to leave, there was light, so things were a little more visible. There were blood splatters all along the side of the back of my truck. That's when I finally put the pieces together and realized that whatever was standing behind my truck was banging the small dead deer it had against my truck. That's what the banging was. I don't know if it was doing that to kill the small deer or if it was doing it to get somebody's attention to draw them over to my truck for an ambush. Whatever it was gave me instant chills as I had memories, vivid memories of those damn teeth again and that thing that stood up behind my truck. I didn't want to think about it anymore. I just got in my truck, ignoring it, and got home and sprayed all the blood off with my hose. That particular job site I got called into to cover a supervisor who had been out scared the living hell out of me and scared me so bad I have had second thoughts about returning as a night shift supervisor. I grew up in a hollow in a pretty small town in rural West Virginia. The hollow is roughly 3 miles long, but surrounded by family-owned forest land, at least 10 acres or more deep in every direction. The only homes located on the hollow were all family. We lived in the very last house on the road. We were the dead end of the road, and our closest neighbor was an uncle, about 200 yards down a field. My brother and I grew up very poor, so we spent most of our free time outside, roaming the woods and whatnot. I remember so many times wandering around in the woods when it would just fall silent around us. Birds suddenly stopped chirping. Little animals stopped rustling in the leaves. Just complete silence. We always took that as our own personal signal to head home, like the woods were saying, "That's enough for today." As kids, we never thought much of it, but now, recounting this story, it definitely makes sense. My brother and I grew up apart as we went to middle school, so we didn't spend a lot of time together in the woods anymore, and mostly stayed in our own rooms like preteens do. One evening, though, our parents decided to go out for a little bit, and leaving my brother and I with nothing to do. We decided to take a little hike for old time's sake. I was around 12 and my brother about 14, so this was roughly June 2004 or 2005. He had picked up cigarettes as a habit, so I credited his idea to head into the woods and as an excuse to smoke freely and not have to worry about our parents popping in and catching him or smelling the smoke. We headed out and hiked a pretty decent distance from home, definitely far enough to keep his nicotine habit a secret from our parents and way out of sight. We decided to stop and sit for a bit. It was mid-evening and the sun was dimmer, but left us enough time to hang out for a while and make it back home with enough time to spare before it was dark out. He set into smoking his cigarettes, and I had picked up a stick and was just whacking plants and digging in the dirt. We were having short bursts of conversation, but mostly sat there, lost in our own thoughts. After about 30 minutes of sitting there, that strange silence fell over us, and we looked at each other to gauge if the other thought we should head back like we used to as kids when it got quiet out there. My brother just shrugged and lit another cigarette, so I went back to digging in the dirt, lost in my own business. I was feeling a little uneasy, but figured I was just being a chicken because my brother seemed completely unbothered. It was so silent I could hear my brother calmly breathing across from me and could even hear the tobacco crackle when he took a draw off a cigarette. I heard a little rustling that sounded a little off in the distance and some twigs breaking. We literally grew up in the woods and were taught about all kinds of wildlife by our hunter of a father. I credited the rustling to a deer or a coyote off a ways from us and never looked up. A few minutes later, though, something caused me to look up. The calm breathing I had heard from my brother seemed to catch in his throat. I jerked my head up to see what was wrong with him. His face was pure white, and he was looking a little to my right and back behind me. Normally, I would have laughed it off because my brother loved trying to scare me and play little pranks. But the look on his face was pure horror. I turned my whole body in the direction he was looking. About 50 or so yards away was a creature. This thing was standing on two legs and stood every but of 7 foot tall. Even at the distance, it looked huge. I backed toward my brother without taking my eyes off this thing. It looked like it was covered in fur, dark brown or black. I'm not sure about the eyes since we were just far away enough not to make out the smaller details, but if the sun had hit them, I can guess they would have been yellow or gold. We kept gaze with it for what seemed like hours, even though it couldn't have been more than a minute or two. It didn't move the whole time we stared at it to this point. It was like sizing us up as we were it. After what seemed like an eternity, which was probably only 3 or 4 minutes by now, it kind of huffed at us. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It just seemed to be testing us to see how we would react if it threatened us in some way. We stood concrete still. It then dropped on all fours and took on a single awkward step toward us, like it wasn't moving on all fours, but wanted to seem animalistic. Again, we did not move. After being told all your life not to run from predators or they will chase you, we were not risking a race with this thing. It took one more clumsy step toward us. When we didn't budge, it took off in the opposite direction. As soon as it was completely out of sight, we darted toward home. I don't think we had ever cleared the woods so quickly in our lives. We burst through the front door and locked it behind us. We just collapsed in the living room and never spoke of it again. My mom recently began getting very sick, and so I've had to come and stay with her to be her caretaker. I've been her caretaker now for about 7 months. She's still able to get up and get around, but not a whole lot like she used to. I'm her only child, so I'm obligated to give her the support that she needs. Now, this happened just last month, in December. We live quite a ways out of town on a lone road that is surrounded by pine on both sides. You take a right down about half a mile, and her house is to the left. She has some neighbors, but they are more spread out. We are the first house on the street. There's a lot of logging around this area and has been for some time. I know on the other side of the road beyond the pine was some new construction going on. They were clearing trees for more development. Since this was in December, it gets dark fairly early, like 4:30. This happened probably around 8 p.m. if I remember right, at night when my mother was driving home from the grocery store just to pick up a few things. I hear her park and run faster than I've ever heard her run to the door and slammed it shut. I look over and her face is pale white and she looked like she had just seen a ghost. I asked her what was wrong and she tells me she hit the biggest dog she's ever seen in her life. She went to tell me that she was pulling into the road and this humongous dog ran across the road and she collided with it. She was too scared to get out and check for damage, so she just drove right here. Confused and concerned, I ran outside with the porch lights on to check if there was any severe damage. I didn't see any immediate damage, dents, or any scratches of any kind. However, there was this long stringy hair all over the front of her Ford Escape and in the front grille. Bizarre, but I've never seen any kind of dog like what she described. I don't even think any of our neighbors close by have any dogs that I'm aware of. She obviously hit something. I grabbed a handful of the stringy hair and brought it to her and asked her if this belonged to what she had hit. She said yes. I can't explain this for myself, nor is there really any evidence to point that this is anything other than the ordinary, but it's still rather strange. When I asked her to give me more details on what she saw, she explained to me that it was just gray and dark in color, and about the size of a moose. I don't know if I necessarily believe her, but this is just what she relayed to me. Boy, do I have a hell of a tale for you, what lurks beneath. I've never written this to somebody before, and I'm hoping you'll be receptive to my experience. I remember it vividly, clear as day, every detail, and so I'm going to lay it out for you, the nitty-gritty. 10 years ago, I had just turned 21. Well, almost. It would have been August of 2009. To celebrate, me and 3 friends of mine drove all the way out to Hiawatha National Forest and northern Michigan. We drove from Washington State. We wanted to make a road trip out of it with my buddy Nathan, who was with me. He had family up in northern Michigan. Our plan was to stop and see his family briefly, and then go party. I was also with my other buddy CJ and his girlfriend Ashley. We had packed everything up on a Friday and left for northern Michigan. We spent about 3 days in total to reach our destination at Nathan's aunt's and uncle's house. Between all the frequent food stops and bathroom breaks, we were pretty antsy from being in a car for so long and just wanted to get out and go celebrate. We had come to party, and that's exactly what we were set out to do. Before we left his family's house, we loaded up on some Jack Daniels and beer. I have had an interesting past with old Jack. Our plan was to head north, deep into the Hiawatha National Forest, and find a good spot just to hike miles in and set up camp. Or so that was the plan. We drove up quite a ways. If I remember accurately, we passed Mapleville, which is way up there in Wisconsin. If you head east of Highway 41, you'll reach this lone road called NF13 with deep woods on both sides of the road. This was where we were going to venture off and begin our celebration. Along NF13, there are several different pullouts. Well, I'm going to call them pullouts for this story, because they're not necessarily roads either. They're more like pathways with only vehicle marks on the ground to indicate that you can drive down there. We suspected there to be campers or whatnot in them since they were just unmarked, and we didn't want to invade anyone's privacy. So, we just pulled our car off to the right of the road and got all of our stuff out and ready to go. We got all of our backpacks on, and the camping equipment and beer, and we were going to head out with handfuls of stuff. There's no marked camping spots or campgrounds where we were headed. I was aware that there was a campground within 20 miles of us. I'm not sure whether south or north, but we wanted to just go and explore the woods, be more secluded. I knew there was a stream west of NF13, so we headed in that direction. We probably spent 2 or so hours pushing onward west through the thick woods. We had our backpacks, tents, and cases of beer. It took us hours with all the breaks we had to take to get and find the perfect spot. But once we found it, that was it. We quickly set up our camp and started blasting music through our iPod. We had brought little speakers that were battery powered that we started blaring Lil Wayne through. We were cracking beers and drinking Jack and going crazy. At this time, I don't know the exact time, but the sun was starting to set. It was in August, so I don't know, maybe 7? Either way, we had a ton of beer. I shotgunned so much beer that I vomited at one point. Ashley and CJ were having a great time, but sought to retreat to their tent multiple times for 15 minutes because they needed to talk in private. We all knew what they were doing, and they were pretty vocal about that. Well, Ashley was, at least. Anyway, that would just leave me and Nathan to pound more beers. This repeated until about 11 p.m. I remember that because I had left my phone in my backpack all day and wanted to see if I had any service at all and pulled it out. I didn't have service, but it was 11:02. I felt fairly drunk, but was not shit-faced. Nathan was so drunk, and I think CJ and Ashley were either having pillow talk, or they had passed out at this point. So much for staying up late on my 21st, I thought. Nathan and I thought we would start to tone it down and just sat by the fire we made and bullshitted for maybe another hour or two before it was time to settle into our tent. Oh, I should expand on that. We brought 2 tents in total, one for me and Nathan to share, and one for CJ and Ashley that they shared. They were across from one another with the fire in between us. Once in our tent, it didn't take us long to settle in our sleeping bags with a hearty, "Night, bro," and in my half-drunken stupor, I passed out. Next thing I know, I'm being shaken awake by Nathan. "Wake up! Wake up!" It took me a couple of seconds to come to, but now I'm pissed he's woken me up, so I snapped at him. He grabs me and says he thinks there's a bear outside of our tent. I shut up and I quietly listen intently, just like he is. Interestingly, the first thing I heard or didn't hear was the sound of the forest. It was August and the forest was alive and full of bugs and crickets all night during our drinking binge. Now it had fallen silent. I didn't hear a single sound. That was off. Then I started to hear heavy thuds, like from a heavy animal. Then I really started thinking there was a bear walking around our tent. It sounded big and I could tell it was close. Me and Nathan looked at each other and held our breath. We heard this thing get close to our tent and start sniffing. I really began to freak out, trying my best not to scream. I was terrified of bears, and I knew absolutely nothing about the temperament of bears, other than the fact that they can eat you. The sniffing continued, and then this animal seemed to totter off away from our tent. It started to huff and grunt like bears do. We heard it start to leave our tent, and could hear it still making noises. The noises began to trail off further and further. It started to get quiet, and I remember telling Nathan that we can relax. The bear was just strolling through, and now it's gone. As soon as I finished that sentence, I hear this crazy animal squeal and roar like I had never heard in my life. Nathan and I's attention snapped over to the side of the tent, freaking out. We started hearing a bunch of roaring, growling, and commotion going on. It was hard to tell how far away it was. It was in the middle of the night, and it was pitch black outside. It couldn't have been too far away. We knew it was somewhat close by. The roaring ceased after maybe 30 seconds. I could not exactly tell what the fuck we just heard. It sounded like a bear fighting off a dinosaur. It was the most frightening thing to listen to in the middle of the night in the pitch black darkness. Nathan and I are basically shitting bricks at this point, shaking when we hear CJ scream out in the distance. He sounded far away, but it was undeniably his voice. Nathan and I shot each other a panicked look, and I quickly and slowly and as quiet as I could unzipped the tent, just enough that I could see his and CJ's tent. The door flap was open. I turned back to Nathan and told him it was CJ. I slightly stuck my head out of the tent and yelled, but whispered at the same time, "Ashley, are you in there?" I heard her softly sobbing in the tent. She whispered up telling me she heard CJ scream too, and all of the commotion, but was too scared to get out of the tent. She didn't even know he had left the tent until she had awoken to all the commotion. The woods at this time were silent, and we weren't sure what to do. Nathan argued in whispers that we need to go out and look for him to make sure he's okay. And I started arguing back saying, "Did you hear what we just heard? I'm not going out there with what we heard." That's when we started to hear noises in the brush nearby. Then we started to hear the growling. It was extremely low. I remember the bass to it. It was demonic, and not all the same energy like the bear brought earlier. This was different entirely. The bear that we were certain was in our camp before was sniffing around and probably just curious. We could tell it was a bear, just alone due to its huffing sounds and breaths, and the thuds on the ground. There is just certain sounds bears make. I mean, it was unmistakable. This, though, was different. The footsteps sounded incredibly heavy, but heavy in a different way. It sounded like it was walking on 2 legs, not 4 different legs, and it sounded slow, like this animal was trying to be sly. The growling and humming it emitted were so evil. I don't know how to relay the emotion. Nathan and I turned white. We knew we were in grave danger. Something else besides a bear was outside of our tent. I was frozen in fear, but I knew I had to do something. I didn't have any weapons on me or near me. I had a pocket knife in my backpack somewhere, but that wasn't going to help me at all in this situation. Nathan pulls out this police-like flashlight, which I didn't even know he had, out of his sleeping bag and shines it outside the tent flap, looking around with a flashlight at whatever was around the camp. My heart dropped at his bravery in fear of him invoking whatever animal is out there, and that we're in here. He didn't care. He wanted to try and scare this animal off. He moved the light just right, and at some point, fully illuminated right by this tree, the ugliest wolf, if you want to call it that we have ever seen. It was looking down at the ground and slowly lifted its head up to meet its gaze with Nathan's beam of light. It let out a nasty growl. It was pissed. I started crying. The size of this thing's claws and teeth alone were enough to do it right in that moment. But its size alone, and the fact that I was looking at a werewolf standing 30 feet away from our tent, really drove it home. Nathan quickly turned the flashlight off and zipped up our tent as fast as he could and dove back into his sleeping bag. I've never seen him so pale in my life. I thought he was going to puke. I was on the verge of having a mental breakdown, knowing that we just saw what we did and it was real. Now I'm stuck in this tent. CJ is gone and poor Ashley is left all alone in the nearby tent, unsure of her safety. We have no weapons and there's a goddamn werewolf walking around our tents. But things quieted down. We didn't hear anything. Not even the thudding of this thing's footfalls walking around now. That made us even more nervous. What if it was sneaking around now? What if it was employing stealth to try and get us? We had to stay awake. We could not fall asleep in case this thing tried to get us. This was the worst passing of time I've ever experienced in my life. We were probably in that tent for hours upon hours, just lying awake, constantly on high alert and aware of our surroundings, but couldn't move. We finally started to see daylight at some point, but didn't want to risk getting out of the tent until we had more visible light. We were so exhausted from the sheer adrenaline rush and the intensive amount of fear. None of us had really slept at all. If at any point during this experience I still had alcohol in my system, it had scared me stone cold sober. I guess I should have checked my phone for the time, but I didn't. It was summer, so it gets bright early, like 5 a.m., so maybe it was between then and 6. Nathan finally signaled for us to get out of the tent and just leave our shit. We were gonna grab our essentials, but fuck the tents and the beer. We didn't want anything to do with being out this far in close contact with that freak of nature, freak of a monster out here. Once it was light enough, we got out of the tent. We could see enough that our camp had been thoroughly rummaged through. Whether it had been done by the bear or whatever it was we saw, we weren't quite sure. We ran over to Ashley and CJ's tent, and Ashley had been curled up in the fetal position asleep. We woke her up and told her we needed to go find CJ and get out now. She had fallen asleep from pure exhaustion. I don't blame her. We started to head back towards the way we came. Luckily, I know we weren't far from the vehicle, so we headed back in that direction. Now, this is where shit got really real for us. We're running back with just our backpacks towards where we believe we parked on NF13. We're yelling for CJ, but nothing, of course. There was a bloody trail, and we couldn't make out what it was, but if I had to guess, it looked like an animal had been killed and then dragged. It was dragged in the direction where we were heading, so we walked back in the early morning. These drag marks went alongside of us. Up on this little hill as we got to the top, there it was. Well, what was left of it, at least. A large, or when it was alive, black bear. Its body was bloody, mangled, and crushed to a pulp with its guts ripped out and strewn across the ground. It looked like this thing had been crushed by a boulder. Nathan and I were speechless when we came across it, and Ashley gasped. She started crying, saying she just wanted to go home. I knew in that moment if we didn't get back to the car now and escape, we were going to be killed. I don't know what the hell is out there in the woods that can take down an adult-sized black bear, but I didn't want to mess with it. I was filled with fear and adrenaline again, and at one point back to the car, the thought that CJ might have been killed and eaten haunted me. We never found him. We did eventually make it back to the car by the miracle of God himself. It was still early in the morning and no sign of CJ still. Now, we're standing by the car, arguing whether to leave and go find help, or to go back in the woods and look for CJ. Ashley is just crying hysterically, while me and Nathan are continuously arguing about what to do, when we see this lone car in the distance head our way. Then we see the lights and immediately recognize that is a cop car. We turn and signal the car down and the car stops in the road. The cop gets out and asks us if we were okay and what was going on. We explain to the officer our story of what happened, and he tells us that CJ is in the hospital. He made a beeline for the road last night after being attacked by some unknown animal, suffered deep wounds in his back and left arm. Something attacked him, most likely a bear, the cop said, due to the claw size and the amount of sheer tissue damage and blood loss, but he almost bled out and was transported to the hospital. A different officer just happened to be driving by and found him waving on the road, bleeding like a stuck pig. This officer was sent here to come look for us. I guess CJ had mentioned he had 3 other friends, maybe a mile or 2 in the woods, that we needed help. The officer told us he would like to take our names and take our story down. He allowed us to drive to the hospital and meet up with CJ, and of course, he followed. We got to the hospital and CJ was sleeping, all bandaged up. The same officer really began asking questions, even though we told him exactly what happened. Even though CJ was all bloody, he began acting weird. I don't think he believed us. Turns out the PD actually thought we conspired to attack and kill CJ, and that the whole werewolf-bear phenomena thing we experienced was just a clever cover-up to mask our failed attempt at murder. Things got a little crazy and we were brought in for questioning. Each of us, of course, but CJ's story once again had come to save us. He was able to tell that his story lined up with all of our other stories that we experienced. Detectives got to him before we did, so they were able to get his story first and foremost. He told them he had gotten up in the middle of the night to take a piss when he thought he heard a bear approaching. Then, he says he heard all of this crazy commotion, like 2 big animals fighting, and he fled off into the night, with only his phone light. Something ran after him. Something that looked like a wolf walking on 2 legs, and tried to grab him, but it didn't. It slashed his back and left arm pretty bad. He says the run from that to the road was a blur, and didn't even realize he was bleeding as much as he had. He literally had fat oozing out of his wounds, they were so deep. Absolute crazy shit that no one will ever tell you. So there it is, that's my story. I remember it vividly, like I said, and I'll carry it around with me forever, and I will never forget it. I still keep in contact with Nathan on Facebook and don't see much of CJ anymore. He took a coding job down in Western Virginia and obviously made a full recovery. I'll have to see if I can get him to send me a pic of his scars so I can show you. They're gnarly. Oh, and him and Ashley broke up a long time ago, so I haven't kept in contact with her in ages. But there you go. Believe it or not, I swear by the Bible and all that is holy that this is what happened to us, including the accusations that we somehow tried to murder CJ and that whole mess. I'm glad it's in my past where it thoroughly belongs. Summertime 2006. I went camping in Arkansas, west of Eureka. I believe this is right off of Beaver Lake, since that's the only known lake in that area, to my knowledge. During that time, I was doing a lot of traveling, on-foot hiking around the mountains. I hiked the entire summer by foot, and would just camp out in the middle of the woods. I traveled a lot along Arkansas into the Ozarks and down south. This event happened sometime during that journey, and I've only ever had an experience like this then. I had been hiking all day long, and it was rather hot, since I believe this happened in July. I decided to set up camp, and maybe a mile away from the bank of the lake. After setting up my tent, I did my usual explore a little bit until nightfall had arrived. I had an electronic lantern that I used to go and get water for my canteen. I would bring this canteen back and boil the water. I approached the bank of the lake, and I heard rustling off to my right. As I turned to look and see this bizarre animal staring at me, I noticed its striking yellow eyes staring right at me. And in the darkness, my eyes adjusted. I could begin to make out the head and realized it was a large dog. I started to panic because I thought it was a wolf, but noticed the body wasn't right. It was on all fours, but its lower back was hunched down. It's hard for me to explain, but it kind of had a hyena-looking body, if that makes sense, where the front arms are much longer and the back legs are shorter. I believe I must have startled this thing when I stepped out of the woods to walk up to the bank of the lake to get water. I was frozen in place at this thing. I began to notice after just a few moments, it frantically kept looking behind it and then back at me. This went on for probably another 5 to 10 seconds, if I had to guess. At that moment, I was confused and not quite sure what was happening. But then it dawned on me that this creature wasn't alone. Briskly, I turned around and quickly paced back to my tent. I was very concerned because I have never seen an animal like that and had no idea what I was dealing with. I ended up skipping dinner that night and just crashing out early, keeping my machete near me all night long. The following morning, I packed up and moved on and never experienced anything strange like that again in my time since then. This includes anything like Bigfoot or anything else that might be unexplained. I didn't really see any details because it was dark outside, other than its eyes, which seemed to have a faint glow to them. The body, I was only able to see somewhat of a silhouette, and could tell it was a dark shape sitting there. Even though I had my lantern, its light couldn't extend far enough for me to see the details of this animal. I have no idea what kind of predator I was dealing with. For all I know, it could have been an undiscovered species of wolf or something. I should probably reiterate and say that this wolf, or so I will call it, was huge, easily double the size of a Great Dane. It was so unnatural. Pairing that with the glowing yellow eyes really just made me uneasy. My wife and I used to live in southern Ohio for quite some time. My wife worked as a nurse and would be pulling all sorts of random shifts. Sometimes her schedule would call her to work from 9 a.m. to 4 p.m., while other times she would work from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. It was so sporadic and it really wore her down the few years she worked at that hospital. For those in question, they were extremely short-staffed during this time period, and she was willing to give her soul to her job, having just got out of med school and having need to build her career. I would try and call her on her breaks through the hospital line and check up on her. This was back in the early 90s, so we didn't have cell phones or anything like that. Everything was landlines. One night, she was returning home in the early morning hours. I can't give you an exact time because I believe my wife doesn't exactly remember. She knows it was after midnight, but before sunrise. She was driving back home when having to make a sharp bend in the road before pulling into another road that leads down to our house. As she made the sharp bend in the road, her headlight shone her something straight from the pits of hell. Crouching about 50 feet away from the road was this large, dark brown shape that had a wolf-like appearance, but had a human-like physique. She said when her headlights hit this thing, it gave no eyeshine. Instead, she told me that this thing had coal-black eyes, and it was like they absorbed the light of the headlights of the car. Everything else lit up. Even the fur glistened in the shine of the light, but the eyes were a solid black. She was in hysterics, and stayed that way until she pulled up into the house, and ran in the house in a fray. It really terrified her seeing what she did that night. I knew for years afterward she had nightmares about that wolf face with the black eyes, haunting her in her sleep. Terrified it would find her and come after her. We moved about 4 years later, but she never ended up seeing that same creature that night. I really have no choice but to believe her. I mean, my wife is a very on-point individual, She wouldn't just make up something like that. It still haunts me how she came in the house, trembling with fear and weeping. For a while, she wanted to see a psychiatrist about hallucinating, but she said it was real and she just didn't make it up. She had been working all sorts of shifts for a long time and possibly chalked it up to exhaustion, but even then, nothing. No matter what time of night or day she came home, she never saw it again. This was the first and last time she saw what she did. I've owned my house now for a good 10 years and have never noticed this problem until just last spring. I have a good portion of my yard up front that I have set up for a 24 by 24 vegetable garden. Nothing extravagant, but it allows me to grow my onions, peppers, basil, and tomatoes. I've had this vegetable garden set up since I moved in and never seen such a creature in my life. It all began in the spring. I would go out in the morning and tend to my vegetables, and I couldn't help but notice the continuous feeling of a bad omen. This feeling would just start in the pit of my stomach and take over, and I could never figure out why exactly. This went on for weeks, and the feelings only intensified. I believe it was around early May when I discovered a pair of eyes staring at me from around 8 feet off the ground, not too far off into the thicket. In that very moment, I vividly remember watering my dahlias and turning to look, and there were these yellow glowing eyes. Initially, I didn't take it as fear because I had to register that it was actually eyes looking at me, and then I realized that these eyes were very high up and attached to something rather large. I panicked and dropped my watering can and ran for my house and locked my doors. I did not go out of my garden the rest of the day. I began to feel uneasy, even in my own house. I felt like I was always looking for these pair of eyes. I kept my curtains and windows closed after that. Things seemed to die down for a little while until about a couple weeks later when I step outside my house in the evening and notice this big gray hairy shape off in the woods to my right. I made a beeline for my car and drove out of there. I'm sure I left smoke in the gravel. I returned the following morning without noticing anything out of place. This is where I start to notice this animal really watching me. After that, this thing started getting closer and closer. I first got a real good look when it started to charge at me when I was working on painting my fence by my vegetable garden. I heard this loud crash bang, and as I looked over, this massive gray walking wolf on 2 legs is charging right at me. I fled in fear and locked myself inside my house and kept all of my knives near me. I called the police, but they said they couldn't help me, and then I just needed to be careful of the wildlife around, like to not leave food out, don't provoke them, etc. So much for that. June did come, and I would catch this thing looking in my windows. Luckily, I never saw it directly because I kept my curtains closed, but they were thin enough for light and shadows to come through, and I would see the silhouette of a massive wolf head in my windows. It would take every ounce of me not to scream, and the experience was traumatizing in its own. As summer drew closer, there would be nights I could sense it was outside my house, pacing or just waiting. I didn't really know who I could turn to or what I could do. Things stayed about the same until about mid-July when I remember suddenly things just stopped. The feeling of evil had disappeared, and I was able to go back out to my garden peacefully. I stayed on high alert for weeks afterwards, thinking it was a trap, but I have yet to still encounter this creature. I still live in the same house as of now, and I'm writing this to you. It's January 14th, 2020. My only fear is that this thing will return come the spring, when it's time to tend my garden once again. Do you have any ideas of how I can get rid of this? About 3 years ago, I encountered what I could only explain then as a deformed hyena. It was in the later part of the day, under dusky conditions, and I was small game hunting at the time. I did not feel any fear because I was carrying my over-under shotgun at the time. Its eyes were kind of strange, I remember, and it had very pointy ears. Its head was almost cartoon-like as its snout had messed up, overgrown hair. Its fangs looked unusually long as well. For some time before I seen it, I heard a very, very long coughing noise, like a cat coughing up a fur ball. However, this went on for a long time, so whatever did had strong and large lung capacity. I doubt a lynx or cat could have been the noisemaker. I have no idea if this dog-like creature was the source of the strange and long coughing fit. Another strange thing along this trail, I always seem to be under the watchful eyes of a flying turkey vulture. Now, these are newcomers to Alberta, but a few mating pairs have been reported up here, and this is common local knowledge that no one questions. This coughing bout I have heard at least once before in this specific area. Never seen this source in the nearby dense boreal forest. This wooded area is kind of on the edge of an oil exploration, and is an active work area now, so I don't hunt there anymore. Which all in all is too bad, as it's chock full of small game, such as rabbits. During this encounter, the woods were unnaturally quiet. It's hard to move in many areas off trail because the evergreen limbs reach so far close to the ground. An upright person would be stooped over to move any kind of speed in many areas. Quadrupeds have a definite advantage here over people, and the area is also ridged with swamps and marshy, very uneven ground that one can easily turn your ankle on. There were other strange moments then. I think when I did see this animal, I sat down on a large rock with my gun across my lap and caught the first glimpse as it was circling me. I think to catch my scent on the wind. I just caught a glimpse of it passing behind a tree in the dusky light conditions. It had hocks like a dog, but as it came around the tree, still on all four legs, I noticed the front legs were longer than the back legs. Its back legs bowed upward, and I got the distinct impression its frontal back, chest, and leg muscles were much more pronounced and muscular than its back legs. I believe the front coat was a lighter color, with some reddish tones too. It looked like a hyena loose in North America to my very own eyes. It was not a black bear. I'm very familiar with bears. It was canine-like, but not any canine I have ever seen before or since. My brother, who was not there, found a near-perfect picture of another critter online, on another crypto site, and the picture was said to be taken near the very same Wisconsin River. In the picture, it looked like it was on a farmland corral or fence line, in the early spring because of the white and light snow cover, and it was near twin to what I saw that fall evening in Alberta. If you're looking for this picture, simply Google it to see what I'm talking about. A pretty traumatizing incident happened to me when I was around 12 years old. I had an encounter with what I would explain to be a werewolf. It wasn't until I was older that I started learning about cryptids like Bigfoot, and much later on, DOGMAN. I drew interest in learning about this because I felt like it would supply me with an answer to what I had experienced when I was a kid. After reading and listening to several different encounters by several different YouTubers, I came across you. This is why I'm writing to you, to tell you what happened, and so that your readers can know that these things do exist. They are out there. At the time, I was thoroughly convinced it was a real-life werewolf, but I was always in denial about it until I learned that there are these things called DOGMAN. When I was around 12 years old, I used to walk this long trail that was around 3 miles near my house. I was in my first year of middle school and very athletic. I loved track and loved to run. So at that age, I was really focused on building up my endurance and stamina, so I would try and walk this trail every day. I had been walking it for months prior to this incident happening. I felt like this particular afternoon was really no different than any other day. I couldn't tell you exactly where along the trail I was, because it didn't just happen in one spot. It happened all throughout much of the trail. It felt off to me just walking on the trail that day, and I wasn't quite sure why. I began to notice that things were abnormally quiet. It's very common to hear the wild around you since it goes to the forest. I would usually hear the birds and the rustling of random animals, but that day, all was dead silent. It was in May, so it should have been teeming with life, but it was dead. I don't think I was down the trail for more than 15 minutes before I started to smell wet dog and a pungent odor in combination with that smell. I did not know it at the time, but Later in life, I would know to learn that other pungent odor as death. I know because my grandmother, whom I was very close to, passed away when I was 18, and I was in the room with her when she died. She gave off this very distinctive odor, and if you've ever been around anyone who's died, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. That's what I smelt along with wet dog. I remember I started to feel very uncomfortable, but I decided it was probably just me wigging out and needed to push through. I don't even think it was that much later when I started to hear something paralleling me in the woods to my right. At one point, I stopped and whatever was following me stopped too. That's when my heart really began to race out of my chest, and I felt like I was in danger. I didn't know who or what was in the woods with me, but I felt like they were there to hurt me. Luckily, I knew I had endurance on my side and figured whatever it was, I could outrun it. Obviously, at the time, I thought it was a person because I hadn't seen what it was yet. I stood there for a moment, still as a statue, and thought to myself, I'm going to try and run to the end of the trail and beat this thing. I quietly took in the longest breath and began to crouch down in the sprinter's position. Soon as my knee bends down, I hear the lowest guttural growl come from only around 10 feet away in the forest. It was so loud I felt it vibrate through my bones. Whatever it was had to have been huge. That growl is so deep, I must have thought it was a demon. I took off sprinting. I don't know how, but this thing took off along with me, and stayed along with me the entire way I sprinted. I was thankful that I wasn't getting winded because I was really able to push myself out of pure adrenaline and the fact that I was in really good shape to be able to make it near the end of the trail. I was probably within half a mile, I guess, from the end of the trail when this thing jumped out on the trail behind me. As I'm running, I'm turning my head around to look who it was, and my body tensed up a little when I realized this wasn't a person. Somehow, miraculously, my legs didn't stop moving because I was in such a state of panic that this thing stopped following me. I kept looking back as I'm sprinting towards the end, and this thing is just standing there, watching me run. Either somebody was in an extremely convincing werewolf costume, or I really ran into a real-life werewolf. I replay that moment over and over in my head, but then I can't explain the growl. I don't know if it was chasing me out of its area or territory or what. Eventually, I did lose sight of it and was able to make it back home. I had been crying because I was so terrified. I never ended up telling my parents about it because I knew, of course, they wouldn't believe me, but I didn't know how to rationalize what I experienced at only 12 years old. It haunted me for quite a while after that, and I never went back to the trail. Instead, I just focused on running around the neighborhood. I did open up to my friends about it in high school, and they believed me, but when asked if they ever experienced anything like that, or even knew anybody who did, they didn't. Earlier, I said that I learned of this creature later on in life, and it was after high school when I really started researching the paranormal and creatures. At the time, I never associated what I saw in that category until I discovered DOGMAN and learned more about how people describe it and the way this thing behaves. I hope telling my story allows your readers to confront the reality that they're faced with every day, if they'd experienced something they don't feel like they could share with others. I enjoy hunting throughout the Michoud State Forest, located in Pennsylvania. There's many of us around here that enjoy a good bow hunt, and I am no exception. To give you a better layout of the state forest, this area is a higher elevated forest, full of white pine and oak trees all throughout with thicker flowers and brush. This was in 2003, and I've had several friends who've been hunting in and around this area for years. I've gotten warnings that because of the lush population of deer, there's a high amount of Bigfoot activity in certain areas. I was a Bigfoot believer before this happened to me, but I had no idea these wolf creatures existed. I didn't even think it was a possibility. I've gone hunting in this forest a few years prior to this event and never had anything strange occur, so I was confident and ready to get myself a nice trophy buck this year. I got up in the wee early hours before sunrise and made it out there with my bow. I remember the air being crisp and cool. The onset of fall was really setting in this particular year. I remember walking quite a ways and making it to one of my stands that I had set up in the area. This particular one I had perched quite high up in the tree, more so than normal. I climbed up and climbed in, pulled out my coffee flask, and sat and waited. I don't know at what point that I noticed the silence, but I became aware after some time the woods had died. Nothing. You could hear a pin drop from a mile away. It felt eerie. I've been doing this for a while, and I've never had my skin crawl like it did in that moment. From what I would estimate to be about 300 plus yards away in the woods was a bunch of whimpering and howling. This was loud. It sounded distorted, not like you would expect if you heard a coyote or a wolf, both of which I've heard, and it didn't quite match these sounds. I was curious, and so I kept trying to look around for any movement or anything that I could possibly see. Still, nothing. The whimpering and howling had stopped, and I began to hear movement in the brush from a little ways away, coming in my direction. Light was just starting to break, and I could start to make out minimal details around me. Things were still dead silent other than this movement that began sounding closer and closer. It sounded heavy, and I wasn't sure if it was a deer coming my way or what, but I could make out that there were multiple of whatever animal was approaching my direction. I heard branches breaking to my left, and out stepped these three beings. Beings is what I'll call them because it wasn't an animal, and it for certain wasn't a human. These three beings walked in unison together on 2 feet, very tall. If I had to guess, well over 6 feet. Their fur was charcoal black and looked to be like they absorbed all the light in the area. Their eyes, all three of them had this horrible yellow glow to them as they slowly hunched over and walked slowly through the forest below, taking their time with each stride. I tried to stay quiet and not make a sound as I went into full-on panic mode. These monsters, whatever they were, gave off an incredibly evil vibe. If they wanted to climb up into my stand and devour me alive, they could have easily. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. Every step these things took, you could feel it in the ground below. I could tell these creatures weighed a great deal of weight. It didn't surprise me with how much mass they carried around and how tall they were. One of them stopped only feet away from my stand. This thing started lifting up its head and sniffing the air. It sounded loud, like a big bear sniffing right outside somebody's tent. I pissed all over myself. I was so scared. I'm watching all of this transpire before my eyes. I'm very fortunate that my deer stand was up quite a ways in this tree, because had I been lower, it could have just reached up and pulled me out. This thing sniffed the air for a moment and did some sort of weird thing with its mouth. I can't even begin to describe the noise. It was like a clicking noise mixed with a guttural sigh. I don't know how to portray it accurately. It was communicating with the other two. The other two both stopped and looked up in my direction. I felt like I was going to have a heart attack in that moment. I don't think these things saw me, but they looked right up in my stand. One of those things must have signaled for the other two that there was a person up in that stand. I held onto my combat knife like it was my life, and I usually keep it strapped to my thigh, just praying my death would be swift and painless. But they just stood there, all three of them making these clicking, chattering, guttural noises for a moment, and then continued on westward. Once they were out of sight, I began crying. I was petrified. I had a hard time even convincing myself to move my body, and I needed to leave before those things got back. If I was caught on foot, I was for sure a dead man. I wasn't going to have that. I managed to work my body enough to climb down my stand, and I ran as fast as I could back to where I came and left. I should probably give a little more clarity on what I saw and how exactly long that it lasted. Because of the early morning hours with the sun just starting to break through, lighting conditions were poor at best. So a lot of what I saw were massive shapes and silhouettes. and those damn glowing yellow eyes. The shape was a massive body with a dog-like head and pointed ears on top. Reminded me of a wolf or a German Shepherd face. I could make out a snout, but more specific details were hard to accurately point out. I watched the entire thing out of my peephole in the stand. As this thing stood below my stand, it did stick its snout up in the air to smell, and I think it smelt me, and then tried to communicate to the others that I was there. Their chattering sounded as if they were arguing amongst themselves, but again, it was very brief. They kept the same pace and stride all the way to where they were no longer visible. The entire occurrence probably only lasted 3 to 5 minutes at most, but in the moment, it felt endless. It felt as if time itself had come to an utter stop. I didn't think I was going to make it out alive. That experience alone really ruined the outdoors and hunting for me for quite a while. I had a hard time returning to what I was passionate about, and it took a whole 6 years till I could muster the courage to approach the woods again to hunt. The first few times back, I didn't go alone either. I wasn't risking something like that happening again. I never did go back to the national forest and instead hunted with friends on other land or their own properties. I told some of my hunting buddies about what I went through. These same buddies who have had hairy run-ins with Bigfoot himself, and they were in disbelief at a pack of whatever I ran into was out there in the woods. I was asked if I think what I encountered was a family of Bigfoots, but it didn't behave the way you hear Bigfoots behaving. I don't think Bigfoots have snouts either, and don't have ears on the tops of their heads. The way these animals hunched over as if their front arms were longer than their back legs. I've never seen a squatch in my day, but my buddies who have had plenty of run-ins with them have told me a lot about them. I got a feeling that this was a family or group of whatever these were. I'm just glad I was able to survive and tell you my story. I was driving home from work on a 6-lane highway, heading west into Hamilton, Ontario. As I drove on my side of the highway, I saw a dog cross from the left side to the right. That area is full of trees, bushes, channels, and ravines of water that are offshoots of the lake. When I saw the dog, it was approximately half of a kilometer ahead of me. The astonishing aspect of this dog, well, I'm certain it was a dog, was its length from nose to rump, excluding its tail, covered the almost full width of the lane, which is 8 feet where it was heading, was back into a small valley filled with heavy forestation and another ravine. I couldn't believe a dog could actually grow to that size. I still remind my boyfriend of this occasionally. This was just last fall when I was driving around with my stepfather. I just got him picked up to bring him back to my wife and I's house. He and my mother-in-law lived in a small trailer park out in the boonies, a way out. Lots of farm and agricultural areas. The trailer park is off of a long gravel 1-lane road. This was in at night, so it was dark outside. I'm pulling away from the trailer park area, stepfather in my passenger seat. This hyena-looking animal, walking on 2 feet, walks across the road about 100 feet up ahead. Both I and my father-in-law start freaking out, asking the other if what we both saw was real, and if we really did both see it. My stepdad kept trying to get me to turn around once we passed where it crossed, wanting to see where it went and what it was. I told him I wasn't going to touch that animal with a 100-foot pole, and wanted nothing to do with it. It was ahead of us, so I couldn't see it vividly, but it looked ugly from what I saw. Black and very hyena-ish. That's the best way I can accurately describe it. I had stayed at my friend's place by Lansing for a couple of weeks and decided to take off and head towards the shore of Lake Michigan, up through Petoskey and over the peninsula. It was dark by the time I got to Pentwater, a small resort town on the shore of Lake Michigan in the western part of the state. I was kind of confused at a stop sign and lurched to a stop, started and stopped. I looked up and there was a police officer stopped to my right. I decided to make a right turn, then turn into a neighborhood. I made my way back to the main road and took a right. As I turned back on the main road, I saw a small hill going up into a wooded area on the left. I saw some sort of animal in the grassy area between the road and the trees. I thought to myself, oh cool, I'm going to get to see some wildlife, like a possum or a badger. But as I got near it, it seemed to move in a very unnatural way for an animal like that. Sort of too fast and too jerky as it ran to the side and then down the hill. It appeared to be brown and reddish tobacco colored and furry. It looked much larger too, more like human size. After I passed it, I looked up in my rear view. The animal had stood up on its hind legs and ran across the street, leaning over with its front arms hanging down. Classic werewolf-type horror movie pose. I had been planning on camping out in that area, but no way. I drove over 2 hours before I stopped finally. I'll never forget the day my grandfather passed away. This would have been January 2009. My grandfather and I were very close, largely in part to my father passing away at a very young age due to medical complications. I don't really remember my father a whole lot, but I grew up extremely close to my granddad. At the time this happened, I was 26 and working a local security job. My grandfather lived about 2 hours away from me. Keep in mind this was in the dead of winter and there was a lot of snow and ice on the roads. I got the call early in the morning, about 5 a.m., that he never woke up. My grandfather is usually up at 3 in the morning and goes to bed at like 6 or 7 in the evening. I fly in my car out to my grandparents' house. Because they live so far out, there's certain old highways and roads I have to take to get to them, and with the snow and ice in the early morning, it becomes a very treacherous situation very fast. As painful as it was losing my grandfather that day, something else happened to me that terrified me to my core. I'm almost to my grandparents, and I'm pulling up on this long dirt road which is around 6 miles, with their house near the end. They lived in the sticks, and I'm surrounded by pine and fir all around me. I see what I can make out to be a large animal eating a dead deer in the middle of the road. I pull up slowly, and this thing turns around and stands up on 2 legs. Now, let me explain something. As I pulled up to it, it looks weird to begin with because it looked as if it was half man, half wolf, crouching, and I was seeing its backside. But once it turned its head at me and stood up, I slammed on my brakes. I gasped in fear. This thing did not stare at me more than 2 seconds before it crouched ever so slightly and leapt up into the air and disappeared. I couldn't stop screaming and slammed the acceleration so hard I nearly lost control of the car and crashed. I somehow managed to fly down the snowy, icy road without crashing, eventually reaching my grandparents' house only minutes later, or so it felt. There was already an officer on site at the house, and several of my other family members since they didn't live too far away. Even though I was overwhelmed by sadness and despair, I pulled the police officer aside and asked him if he saw anything driving up here, and the cop just looked at me strangely and told me no. Nothing else was said, and I comforted my grandmother, and my family stayed with us there for a few days to take care of my grandmother. Part of me wonders if what I saw that night was the evil that followed him around. My grandmother would tell me multiple times that he had this darkness surrounding him, and she never really elaborated, so I always understood that as just a figure of speech for bad luck. But maybe she meant something more. I found out a little later on that when he was much younger, he dabbled in witchcraft for a very short while. I have no idea if what I saw is related to all that, but judging by what I've researched from the encounters that I've read, I can only make an educated speculation. My Dogman encounter happened on a season opener in November of 2013 in the eastern upper peninsula of Michigan on family hunting property near a town called Cedarville. The house my husband and I were staying up there in had a big front yard, but other than that, the cleared area and the gravel driveway, everything else is pretty deep hardwood forest. I also want to state ahead of time that this happened at around 11 p.m. at night. So everything that's beyond the porch lights was pretty hard to see. My husband and I had gone outside to have a cigarette, and we took our rifle out with us whenever we were hanging around outside, because there's bear and stuff back there in that area. I was up on the porch still, and my husband had gone down the steps into the yard and was facing towards me when we heard these really heavy, slow footsteps coming up the driveway through the woods. It sounded like a really big man, but there was this weird heavy breathing to it, and the footsteps, even though they sounded like a person, sounded heavier than anything I'd ever heard walking in the woods, including full-sized adult bears. My husband looked at me and mouthed, "What the fuck?" And I was trying to figure out what it was that I was hearing, but nothing I had ever heard out there in those woods in my whole life matched the size and breathing and gait of whatever this was, so I was confused and shaking my head. My husband isn't a hunter and grew up in the city, so he was completely confused. I've hunted and tracked basically everything that's indigenous to northern Michigan since I was so small, and I was honestly terrified that this animal was completely unknown to me by sound. It walked out of the tree line at the edge of the yard behind my husband, and it was a lot taller than him, at least 7 feet tall or more, and I'd estimate the weight for its size at around 400 pounds. It was on 2 legs and had super dark black fur that was somehow even darker than the nighttime dark of the woods. It was walking back and forth at that distance from us the whole time this encounter happened, but it would not step into where the perimeter of the porch light was. I had a really hard time making out its torso for that reason, but I saw a wolf-like head and snout with pointed ears that stuck straight up, and instead of front legs and paws, it had really disproportionately long arms and hands. It was on 2 legs this whole time, walking back and forth. I freaked out and grabbed the rifle and just started shooting at it and yelling at my husband to run and get up on the porch. So he did, and then he took the gun from me and told me to find something to use as a weapon and to go inside and to hide. So I did. I got a big knife and went to lock myself in our bedroom, in the closet, and could hear my husband shooting and reloading a bunch for about another 10 minutes. He came in and told me through the closet door that the DOGMAN had finally run off, but he wasn't sure if it was going to possibly come back, so we were both pretty terrified, and I ended up staying in that closet all night until sunrise with my husband, guarding the door with the gun. He told me that he thought I had hit it when I was shooting at it first, but then the next day, we didn't find any blood or hair or anything, which I thought was weird, because I really thought I must have shot it and wounded it at least a couple of times. It moved incredibly fast though, and was agile enough to run through the brush and stuff without really mowing it down or making a bunch of noise, like big animals usually do, running through weird dense underbrush. The whole encounter was incredibly weird and scary. My husband also said that he did see it sort of hunch over and drop down onto all fours a few times, while it was running back and forth at the edge of the yard. But that was when it ran away for good that night, that it was running insanely fast on 2 legs like a man. We didn't see or smell anything bad like a lot of people describe when they see these things. It didn't even leave any noticeable tracks anywhere, even though the thing was so heavy when it was walking up the gravel driveway that I swore the ground near it must have been shaking. We found out later from one of the neighbors that had seen it too, next door, the winter before, when it came up the porch of his cabin and looked in the door window during a party he and his wife had been throwing. He said he heard a really heavy footstep on the porch and pulled back the curtain on the window, and the DOGMAN was standing there on the other side of the glass looking down at him, but that its fur was white then. I think that's probably because there was snow on the ground at that point of the year. My neighbor hollered at everyone in the cabin and told them what he had just seen, and then everyone decided to make a run for it through the woods to his mom's house next door, since her place was a lot sturdier than the hunting cabin. I've known that neighbor my whole life practically since high school, and he would never make something up like that. He was scared even while he was just talking about it. I also read somewhere online recently that another family, about 45 miles north of our area, had a bunch of livestock like cows and horses turn up dead and torn up by some kind of big predator, and that one of the guys in the family saw a giant upright wolf back near his hunting blind spot during deer season, which of course freaked me out since we had our experience on season opener. The land butting up to that family's property is hundreds of miles of the national forest, so it would make sense to me that a big animal would hide in and near a protected area like that when it's hearing gunshots everywhere else. My lot and my neighbor's lot are also alongside state land. My husband and I moved since this all happened, but the experience was so upsetting to me that I constantly research online to see if anyone else has seen this thing up north and what their encounter was like. I've even heard that there's a small pack of about 4 or 5 of them that live in the state forest downstate in Isabella County, and that a bunch of locals in the nearby area have seen, and that somebody even saw one at nighttime in downtown Michigan. What scares me about that is the fact that there's no tree cover there, as that's a city. I wonder if people all over the state are seeing these animals because they're getting forced out of their usual hunting territories due to hunting, logging, mining, and that's really all increased over the years. If anyone else from Michigan has had an experience, please, I would love to hear it. I was headed southbound on Highway 321 at around 9 p.m. at night, just a little north of Chugwater, Texas. This was back in April of 2004. As I'm driving down the road, the largest German Shepherd that I've ever seen steps out onto the road on 2 legs. Startled, I go to slam on my brakes when this thing lifts its left arm to shield its eyes from my oncoming headlights. I come to a stop about 10 feet away from it, and it is just standing there, holding its arm over its face. I'm freaking out, not knowing what the hell I'm looking at, when this thing suddenly, slowly lowers its arm, and I see this piercing amber glow. I had my windows rolled down then, and I could have sworn I heard this animal snarl at me. I was very intimidated because this thing stood at least 9 feet tall. It was very lanky and skinny, and had shaggy long hair hanging off of its arms. I couldn't get a good look at its legs. I went into fight or flight mode and threw my car in drive and swerved around this animal with the acceleration pressed all the way down. It was a surreal experience. It's like everything slowed down in that 1 minute. I didn't bother looking in my rearview mirror to see if that thing was going to follow me. I had such a fear take over me that I felt if I didn't drive off, I would have been done for. I'm a vet student. My university is on top of a hill and outside of town. From my dorm window, which is on the 7th floor, I can see huge wheat fields and a nearby forest. My first encounter was 2 years ago. I have a German Shepherd, who I call Hades, and a husky puppy, which I call Ragnar. The day I left university quite late. It was already dark outside. Usually I don't mind taking them out at night. At night I can let them run without their leashes. They are trained and I know they are going to listen to me. Besides, I knew everyone else knew them and wouldn't hurt them even if they were outside. They have collars that light up since Hades is fully black and Ragnar is fully white, which makes it hard to see him during the winter. I could see them running all around the time. We walked for a while and they were playing and running around. At some point though, Hades stopped and started growling, looking into the wheat fields down the hill. I didn't really think about it. There were bats, owls, and other critters around us. I leashed them, not wanting to run after them if they decided to chase something. After an hour and a half of non-stop growling, I have had enough of it and decided to take Hades home and go out so Ragnar can run a bit more. I got home and expected him to go in his cage. He likes sleeping in there after all. That night though, all he did was stand at the window looking out. Since the pup was whining, wanting to go out again, I tried to drag Hades in the cage and lock him in until I got back. Who knew, maybe he might try going out the window. I got to look out the window. On the parking below, I saw a black figure circling the cars. Thinking that it might be someone trying to steal, I got a flashlight and shone at it. It wasn't a thief. It wasn't a human at all. It looked up, and its eyes reflecting the light from the flashlight. It was black, its head looking very similar to Hades. It was standing on all fours, but when I shone the light, it stood up. The roofs of the cars were barely reaching its midsection. It let out a growl, which I later learned that many of the tenants have heard. Hades went wild trying to bust out of the cage. Ragnar was whining even louder. I realized he didn't want to go out though. He was trying to get as far away from the window as possible. The growl made me flinch, and I dropped the flashlight through the window. I tried to see it again, but it was too dark. I heard the crunching of snow as it left. The next morning, I went to find my flashlight and found a huge dog-like footprint in the snow and a foul smell still lingering. I borrowed infrared binoculars from a hunter friend of mine. Ever since then, I have seen it in the forest, crossing the field and coming near the hill, looking up. I and my roommate have been taking turns keeping watch at night when Hades starts growling. I don't take the dogs out at night, and Ragnar doesn't play and run around anymore. He just stays pressed against my feet. Around summertime, back in 2015, and me and a close bro of mine were startled beyond words when we heard a strange growl walking on the backside of his property. Told about the supposed dogman that lives in Wisconsin, but always thought of it like a cruel joke parents told children. This was nearby some woods, so this happened out in Rock County in Wisconsin. It's actually fairly close to Bray Road. If you don't know anything about Bray Road, I would suggest you look that up. The Bray Road event started the entire werewolf phenomenon that people report seeing, to my knowledge. Anyway, when we heard this weird growling sound, I turned to my bro and said, "Do you hear that?" He nodded yes. We were both scared out of our wits. Neither of us have ever heard an animal like that, and we spent a lot of our time outside. This growling continued and was coming towards us. I noted for my bro to start back towards his house, and this tall canine-like figure steps out of the woods, walking our way. It looks like a large canine with pointy ears. I couldn't see any eyes or really other features besides that. It looked to be about our height and a slender build if I had to guess off memory. Its strides were humongous, and I remember only looking for a few seconds before my buddy and I sprinted back to our house and grabbed a shotgun. Well, his shotgun. All I had was a .22 on me, and I knew that wasn't going to do shit to this animal. We waited by the door for this animal to approach the house, and we knew we weren't going to fight off this animal had it broke in, but we were going to try. Not too much longer later, we heard this thing come up to the house, and what sounded like it stood entirely still. We knew it was stalking us, so we kept the house on lockdown all night long. This thing never attempted to attack us nor the house. In the morning, we went out to look for tracks and found massive canine tracks all over the property and the house. I turned to my bro and told him he needs to up his firepower game. This creature has been coming back to his property, even up until now. He's had to shoot at it several times, but it never attacks him or his house. What makes him nervous is that it's getting really close, almost like an animal that's far too curious. Spent the weekend camping with my brother and family at a packed campground during the weekend. Well, I should say that this happened back in 1996, so this didn't just happen. Anyway, there was a really large man-made lake that my brother and I desperately wanted to explore. My brother and I were only 17 and 15 when this happened. My parents were pretty strict on what we could and couldn't do, even though we were almost of adult age. Luckily for my brother and I, we waited until they fell asleep, around 10 p.m. We snuck out of our tent and went around to explore. It's pretty sad when you're 17 and your parents still helicopter you and give you a hard time, but I guess they were just nervous about us, either disturbing other people or God knows what. Being summertime, there were still a lot of people up and fires going on when we decided to take a couple of the nearby trails after hanging out by the man-made lake. We talked to a few people here and there, making small talk and enjoying the night together. I think at some point we got offered booze but declined. There were quite a few really cool trails around the area, and being 17 and 15, we felt indestructible and decided it was a good time to go night hiking without any sort of light other than our tiny camping flashlights. There's this one really cool trail that extends out quite a ways and then loops back around to the other side of the campground, totaling 2 miles if I remember correctly. It's like a big horseshoe, but the big horseshoe extends into the national forest and then back around. We got on the trail around 10:45 p.m. and only saw a few other people walking their dogs. We were pretty much the only ones there, so it made for fun. I had stolen a cigarette from my father, and I was going to smoke it once we got far enough down the trail. We had been walking for probably around 20 minutes, and everything around us was dark and quiet, since we were in the forest part now. My brother started to complain that maybe we should have gone back, and that if Mom and Dad wake up to us not being there, we were going to be grounded for the rest of our lives. I told him to calm down, and that we would be fine, as I lit up my cigarette. My brother was just being stupid and paranoid at times, so I just ignored it. We continued walking and decided to pick up our pace a little to make good time, because I did not want to be back super late either. We got to a point in the trail where it kind of goes up this little hill that curves around and then dips back down again. My brother grabbed me and stopped me in panic, saying that somebody was out there in the woods trying to scare us. I laughed at him, thinking he was trying to pull a fast one, and yelled out to the woods, "If anybody's out there, we're so scared," and kept laughing. This was all a joke to me, and I would soon find out that it wasn't. My brother shushed me, and we both listened. He wasn't lying. I began to hear shuffling noises in several different places around us in the woods. I'm terrible at judging distance, so I couldn't tell you how far away it was, but it sounded close by. I heard a few bits of shuffling to the right of me, and to the left. My brother began panicking, thinking we were about to get jumped, or some crazy axe murderer was going to kill us. I told him to calm down and let's just keep walking. As we began to walk up this hill, the noise still continued, but it began getting closer to the trail, and closer to the spot we were when we stopped. I told him to just keep picking up his speed, and when we reached the top of the hill, he turned around, screamed, and took off sprinting. In that second, I knew something was terribly wrong, because my brother, who used to be super lazy, and for him to take off sprinting, he must have been spooked. Thinking he was just being melodramatic, I turned around and shone my small flashlight in the direction that he screamed. And down on the trail where him and I both heard the initial shuffling noises, were these two huge dog-like figures standing on 2 legs. The first thing I noticed when I shone my light was the pointy ears and the red glow of the eyes. I couldn't tell if they emitted a red glow from the reflection of my flashlight into their eyes, or they just had an unnatural, evil glow to them. Either way, I froze. My flashlight wasn't great, so it was pretty dim shining that far away, but enough that I saw their faces. They were ugly. It reminded me if you crossed a hyena with a wolf and stuck it on a bodybuilder human body. Huge bodies. I thought these 2 things were demons coming to get me. They just stared at me. I dropped my flashlight and I sprinted as fast as I could, following after my brother and not saying a word. I ran for my life. I've never felt such mortal danger before. Time began to slow down dramatically, and I felt like I was running in a time warp. After what seemed like running for an hour, I made it out on the other side of the trail back to the campground. Turns out we're actually only about a mile away from the end of the trail, so we had walked a good ways before we had saw what we did. I collapsed on the ground shaking when I got to the trailhead entrance. Between the outermost fear and danger and absolute exhaustion, my body was overworked. If these demons were following me and coming to get me, there is nothing I could have done. I felt helpless and alone. Things around me started to get really quiet, and I didn't hear any of the shuffling noises I was hearing earlier. I picked myself back up and fled to my tent, where my brother was already curled in the fetal position, sobbing. I tried to talk to him, but he wouldn't even make eye contact with me, let alone acknowledge me. Neither of us got much sleep that night, if at all, and my parents never knew we even left. Again, this happened back in '96, and to this day my parents don't know what happened. I tried to figure this encounter down as to demons that were coming to get us, but now that I know a little bit more about cryptids and creatures out there that exist, I wonder what's really around there. A little more insight as to the location. I can't really remember the campground because we were doing this long road trip thing with my dad for his business at the time. It was somewhere around Indiana, I believe. That encounter has stayed with me ever since, and I've never been so fearful of my life before. I saw something that put a big scare into me. I'm going to describe it. I'm not sure you'll believe it, but I'm certain about what I saw that day. This happened in August 2009, as I was driving to my husband's place of employment. We live in Gillam, Manitoba, and he is an electrician for one of the generating stations on the river. It was close to 3 p.m. I had just turned off one of the residential roads near my home, ending east on PR 280. About a half a mile after my turn, I caught a glimpse of something tall moving through the trees to my right. Then, suddenly, it jumped onto the shoulder of the road and stood there as I drove by. I looked in the mirror and saw it quickly cross to the other side of the road. I picked up speed and did not stop until I reached the station. I had chills all over. I got a decent look at it. It had a large wolf head, but it was standing upright on legs which looked man-like. I didn't see arms as I passed by, but I did see arms swaying back and forth when I looked in the mirror as it crossed the road. The coloring of the head and body hair was charcoal with darker patches. It was an actual gray wolf, then it was one of the largest ones I had ever heard of. I thought that somebody was playing tricks, but that wouldn't make any sense since it was during hunting season. I did tell my husband, who later checked the area where I saw it. He said that there were reports of a very large wolf along the river a year or two before, but he had not heard of anything beyond that. I still don't know if he believes me. I also said something to my uncle through marriage, who is Chippewa. My uncle told me that it was not a wolf and that I must forget about it. He then recited some words under his breath and told me not to mention it again. That kind of freaked me out. Since it was 5 years ago, I haven't thought much of it until I read a newspaper article about the DOGMAN and sightings people had in other locations. I would like to start off and say that I don't mess around. I'm an avid explorer, but I'm also an avid gun lover. I collect many different kinds of pistols, rifles, you name it. Among my collection, I have a small handful of weapons that I keep on me, especially when I go out exploring into the wilderness, just to keep safe. You never know when a bear might catch your tracks, and if she has cubs around, you're done. I don't mess around for that reason alone. I travel with a .357 Magnum on me. I'm a huge fan of the .44, but I feel like the .357 is much easier for me to aim and for accuracy's sake. Those of you who know what I'm talking about will probably agree. I feel like a .357 is more than sufficient to hold off an angry bear in case I come across one or any other potential predators I might run into. Now, let me tell you about my expeditions. I do really enjoy hiking and camping, but I also just love going out on long expeditions where I walk for 8 to 12 miles, if not more, in many different areas. I spent a lot of time up in the Pacific Northwest, traversing through Washington and Oregon, as well as the Midwest around Ohio, down into Kentucky. I love sightseeing, and I usually travel with a friend or two, for company's sake. When this happened, we were traversing through the Chattahoochee National Forest. Since I keep my Magnum on me, I felt pretty confident I can handle most treacherous situations. We ended up coming across a small creek where the woods around us fell silent. My friend and I both knew what that meant. It stayed silent for quite some time, and we weren't sure whether it was safer to stay put or to go out on the move. Not even 5 minutes we were there when this happened, when we began to move on and we heard multiple sounds all around us. There was shuffling and rustling of the ground and leaves. We heard deep breaths and huffs. These noises were coming beyond our visibility. The brush was so thick we couldn't exactly see what was making these noises, but due to the surrounding sounds, we knew there was more than one of this animal. It was getting dusk out, but there was still light and visibility. These noises began to encroach and get closer. I pulled out my magnum and shot it 3 times in the air. My hand still in the air, the woods go from quiet to a frenzy. I began hearing all sorts of crazy howls, growls, scratching, weird noises, and other stuff. It sounded like 100 coyotes having a WWE match all around us, just beyond our vision. It was so loud, I felt threatened, and I wasn't going to take a chance. I fired several shots randomly into the woods, and things got silent again. I have no idea if I hit anything or anyone. What I did, and nobody should ever do because you don't know if there's people or humans around, and I know it might not sound believable, but I was acting purely on fear in that moment. I knew there weren't people around us, and I knew there was something more sinister going on. My friend and I waited for a moment, and things stayed silent, and we just took off as fast as we could. We were still about 7 or so miles away to where we originally parked and entered, so we had a long trek back. That's the only time I've ever felt threatened like that in the woods. I've had to ward off a bear before, but it was never anything close to the amount of fear that I felt in that moment. I've read many Sasquatch encounters and heard similar things happen, so I don't know if that's what I encountered, but I didn't think that Sasquatches were real, and I didn't think that Sasquatches would growl and howl and make all those sort of weird noises like what I heard. I'm not really sure what surrounded us, but there were multiple of them. We can hear it. Whatever it was had to have been big because of the deep huffs of breath. I never would have guessed in a million years something like that would have happened deep in the wilderness of Georgia. This last winter, I was doing some hiking in and around the Appalachian Mountain area. I discovered what I believed to be DOGMAN tracks. I even made casts of the tracks that were in the wet, cold winter mud. These were huge prints, easily the size of a lion's paw. I believe they're DOGMAN prints because I've been an avid outdoorsman and an avid Bigfoot researcher until only in the past couple of years when I've been hearing more and more about this DOGMAN creature appearing all over. I became increasingly fascinated with this concept and began seeking any evidence I could find, even if it meant running into these things face to face. I have a couple of close friends who are also cryptid researchers as well, and so I sent the cast to them, wondering what their thoughts were. One of my close friends, we'll call him David for the sake of the story, began to tell me about these upright black wolves that roam around this 78-acre plot of land he goes to hunt at. It's state game land, and I don't remember exactly how he gains access to it, whether it be illegally or legally. Either way, he tells me he's seen them down there quite a bit looking through his scope. These things must really feed heavily on deer, because there's a wholesome amount of doe in that area, with the occasional buck that comes through. The numbers have dwindled in the years, but it's still a semi-decent place to hunt in the deer season. David, like I, has been a heavy-duty researcher and a fan of Bigfoot and cryptids. To my knowledge, he did not know about the DOGMAN cryptid until I told him about the casts that I made and sent them to him, and then proceeded to tell me what he had been seeing every fall. He stays a great distance away from these creatures, unsure of what they're capable of. I'm going to try and set up a way I can fly out to him, and he could take me to this area, so I can see them for myself. Wish me luck. "30 years ago, I had to drive up north to Grand Rapids, Michigan for an important business meeting. I was an investor in a small tech company and was going to meet with other investors and the owners, so I needed to drive up to Florida to Grand Rapids. When I entered into Michigan State, I needed to stop and get gas, fill up on food, and the works. I pulled off a bit as this small burger joint that's kind of on the edge of town. I couldn't tell you what town it was, but it couldn't have been too far off the highway from entering into Michigan. I pull up to this tiny burger joint to get a bite to eat, and I go in. It's a tiny restaurant, and I notice I'm the only customer that's there. I go up to the counter, and the manager is there. He turns to me and tells me they're closing down early. He introduces himself and tells me he's sorry for the inconvenience. He expresses to me I need to be careful of driving around here at night. I figured he meant because of gangs or something along those lines. As I'm walking out of the restaurant, he stops me and offers to kindly walk me out to my car. I thought this behavior was very strange, but he seemed very concerned for my safety. Let me just add that I don't think this restaurant is here to this day because I can't remember the name of it, but it was one of those restaurants that it's a one-of-a-kind thing. Geographically, beyond the parking lot had wilderness surrounding all of it except the highway. We stepped outside. He stopped me and offered me a cigarette. He looked me sincerely in the eyes and asked me if I had a moment, and I told him yes. He pulled out a cigarette for himself and lit it and took a drag. He asked me if I was from around here, and I told him no, and that I was on a business trip up here from Florida. He chuckled and proceeded to tell me I need to listen because what he was going to tell me, I probably would not believe. This really piqued my interest, so I gave him my attention. I told him I was all ears. He then told me things that will haunt me and stay with me forever. It was enough to make me tell my fellow investors at the meeting the next day that I will no longer be returning to Michigan and that I will have to withdraw my investment in the company. I remember this guy's name was Roger. I don't remember his last name, but I guess that's not important. He explained to me that he has been working at this restaurant for around 11 years now. As long as he's been working there, they've been really struggling as a business due to an outside problem, he called it. Much of their business continuously gets driven away by these upright, walking canine creatures that keep attacking customers and their vehicles. They hide in the woods and wait and watch for cars to go in and out, and they'll jump out at people leaving or going in. They've chased after cars, but nobody has been killed or seriously injured to his knowledge. Shortly after he took the job 11 years ago, the original owner of the restaurant had retired from being the owner about 6 years prior to his employment. He went missing one night and was last seen at our restaurant, and nobody knows what happened to him. There is never any evidence found, even though there was a full police investigation, which is funny because the police have been called and multiple reports have been made about what's going on at this location, and we've been scoffed at and ignored. It took for somebody to go missing for them to actually take them seriously, but nothing turned up. The investigation eventually ended and things resumed. If it wasn't for the continuous amount of business loans that the second owner had been taking out, we would have been shut down a long time ago. We have had a much easier time functioning during the day, but sightings and attacks will still happen. Obviously, money is hemorrhaging. I can hardly believe what he is telling me, but he had such sincerity, fear, and concern in his voice and face that I was left with no choice. Either he was the world's greatest actor, or I needed to get the hell out of Dodge, and now. These things can range from gray to black and are very territorial and violent. They're all over the state, and if I'm going up to Grand Rapids, I need to be careful and watch every inch of my surroundings. As he finished up his cigarette, he grabbed my shoulder and wished me luck. I was terrified but surprised that as I exited, I didn't encounter anything or sense anything as he explained to me. He wasn't shitting me either, because as I got older, I learned of a creature called the DOGMAN that does terrorize the state of Michigan and matches exactly what the descriptions he gave me. This was around 30 years ago. I want to say 92. There wasn't a lot of talk about DOGMAN, so I had no idea what he was telling me then was actually true. I had heard about Bigfoot, but that's because Bigfoot was so popularized, but I had never heard of an upright canine. The concept was just absurd at the time. I drove about another 4 hours up north until I got to a motel. I got up early, went to my investor meeting, and let them know I'm out and got the hell out of the state of Michigan, and I stay out of that state. I will never return, even though I didn't see anything that Roger told me, but it shook me, and I sincerely believed what he went through is real. This is my grandfather's story. Way back in the 80s and 70s, my grandfather used to work as a mechanical engineer for the Army. He was stationed and worked in a special base that he will not disclose the location of. He did say, though, that this base was around the Georgia area, but miles out in the middle of nowhere. His job was to work on several different pieces of equipment, as well as a vast array of other miscellaneous tasks. He tells me it was quite often that they would constantly be having issues with these wolf-like creatures attacking soldiers as they left and entered the base. He explained that they were fairly tall with very large muscles and human-like legs. I showed him the werewolves from the movie Dog Soldiers, and he told me that not quite, but they look definitely similar. Especially since that's the only movie where I've seen them have human-like legs, and he told me the legs were on point. He also mentioned how all of these things were that it aligned with the height of the werewolves in that movie. That's the closest he's been able to describe these things to me. He said one time, one almost got in as one soldier was leaving, and that its head was nearly blown off by a few of our snipers. These animals were nocturnal, and would use that to their advantage. He said he doesn't recall any of his fellow troops being killed, but his sergeant was attacked and left with a huge scar down his back and face. This had occurred over the course of 4 months, and got to the point to where these creatures were noted as kill on sight. They would only come out at night, and they would stalk and walk around the perimeter. It's almost like they were looking for a weak point to get in. As soon as they became kill on sight, they stopped coming around, and I don't remember if he said anything about seeing them after, but I don't think he did. He got transferred only 6 months after the initial sighting to another part of the country, and didn't keep tabs on anybody in that base at the time. However, he tells me that some of his old buddies from other bases around the country doing similar lines of work had mentioned similar occurrences. One of his closer friends, who was also a mechanical engineer as well, is long passed away now, but this friend at the time was working out of the Southern Oregon base out there. He said that there was constant howls off in the distance at night, with wood knocks and other strange, bizarre noises he could not explain. One of the patrolling soldiers had a near-death encounter with what he could only describe as a giant ape-man thing a few miles outside of the base. This creature smashed the front end of his vehicle to the point to where it was no longer operable and had to flee on foot. My grandfather has other crazy tales about similar things happening, but after all that, he had never had anything else happen to him. When I first took this job to be an over-the-road trucker, I thought it would be really exciting. I thought I'd get to travel the country and see the sights and come home with stories to tell my friends and family. I was right. This job is exciting, but I soon found out that I'm better off not sharing these stories with anyone close to me. Not because I don't trust them, but because I'm worried that they wouldn't believe me. Let me back up. My name is Brittany. I'm 22 years old, and I've been driving with a rather large company now for a few months. I won't name due to obvious reasons though. Ever since my training ended and I got my own truck to start solo, I've seen some pretty weird stuff. When you are driving the loneliest road in America, yes, that is a real name, in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, things can start to get to you. I suppose it was only a matter of time before I saw something out in the desert at nearly midnight. I still had another hour to the nearest truck stop, and blasting the freezing cold air against my face was all I could do to keep myself from dozing off at the wheel. Irresponsible, I know, but until you work this job, you don't understand how much lax comes with it. I was driving this highway in the desert in the pitch blackness of a cold summer night, when suddenly, something runs out in the road in front of me. Before I can even react, it's gone across the other side into the bushes. I barely even got a good look at it, but I could have sworn it looked like a large white dog, faster than any dog I've ever seen. I try to just ignore it and keep driving. I see animals crossing the road at night all the time. It didn't seem like anything to get worked up about. Not even a minute later, I feel my truck lurch to the left and into the other lane. I quickly try to swerve and correct it, and easily step on the brakes so I don't wreck. It could be easy to jackknife an 80,000-pound metal death machine. I slow it down and regain control. I looked for the nearest pullover spot so I can see what the hell just hit my rig, and see if there's any damage. Once I find a spot and turn off, hit my brakes and hop out. I walk around to the other side and see a large dent in the side of my trailer. What in the hell? I say to myself as I walk over to inspect the side of the trailer. It's a huge dent. at least 5 feet wide and tall. No real shape to it, just a general dent. I can't imagine what could have hit me. My first thought was maybe a boulder rolled down from the side of the hill and smashed into me, but I didn't think I was driving next to any hills or mountains. As far as I knew, it was just flat desert. I hear the sound of dirt crunching under footfall behind me, and I turn around. My breath catches in my throat, and my stomach drops as I see something standing not even 50 feet away from me. It's large, menacing, and white. I can't even find the words to describe what this thing looked like. It looked like a very large dog, and that's a stretch. It stood on 2 legs, stout legs, with long forearms reaching down past its knees. Its shoulders were broad and heaving, as if it had just ran a marathon. Its head was mostly shaped like a wolf, with a large snout filled with razor-sharp teeth bared in a snarl, saliva dripping from its maw. Its jet-black eyes bore right through me, filled with hatred and hunger. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place. This creature stood between me and my only salvation, my truck. We stared at one another for a moment until I broke the silence. "You are one ugly motherfucker," I said. It snarled at me. Then, very unexpectedly, it turned and walked away slowly, using all 4 of its limbs, receding into the bushes and into the night. I stood there for what felt like several minutes, wondering if it ever would jump back out and feed on my flesh at any moment. It never came back. I ran around the front of my truck and jumped inside, locking the door quickly and flooring it, as fast as you can floor an 18-wheeler, which is not at all. Soon, I was back on the highway and barreling down it as if my life depended on it. For a while, it felt like it did. Within a half hour, I found myself at the truck stop and shut down for the night. Sleep was difficult that night. I was certain every noise I heard was that damn creature returning. Luckily, though, the night went on without another incident. I have more stories to tell, but this is getting long, so I'll stop here. Remember, everybody, be careful out there on the road. You never know what else is out there with you. I was out looking for a good buck with my .30-06 in dense foliage many years ago, circa 1999 to 2002. I was scouring around the area when I spotted a large black shape stand up from behind a bush and noticed large dog ears on top of its head. That's when I noticed it had a dog head on a human body, and I panicked. This thing was only about 15 feet away from me, and it towered over me. This thing had to have easily been around 7 to 8 feet tall, if not bigger. This was in broad daylight, so I was able to see every detail pretty clearly. I'll never forget its eyes. They were black. It's almost as if they were emanating evil and absorbing all light around it. The thing stared me down for a few seconds before I slowly backed away, never taking my own eyes off of this thing. It had a rather large muzzle, and I didn't quite see any teeth. Its arms looked like they extended well beyond its waist and had what I can tell to be human hands. Extremely large chest and pulsating muscles. In fact, I could see its muscles rippling through its fur. As I'm slowly backing away, I'm trying to make sure this thing isn't going to move in on me and attack. I don't know if it was there before I got there or if it had been following me and planned to attack. It scared the living hell out of me. I don't normally hunt around Dayton, Texas. I thought I would try a few new areas during that period of time, and Dayton was one of the areas. I never knew they had critters like that in that part of Texas, and I stay out of that place now. I can never look at the woods the same again after that night. You see, I was a man of the woods. I would camp and enjoy the wildlife alone. One time, I decided to bring my wife along. We were deep walking along the edges of the mountains. A river ran wide and for miles. As time got near dark, we set up the tent and then held each other by the fire that we started. Soon, though, the sky started to get gray and rain fell. As we slept in the tent, I was having a hard time staying asleep, so I decided to unzip the tent from the bottom and look out a little to sleep for a little bit. On the other hand, my wife was passed out and was a hard sleeper. I guess she just felt safe. As I look outside, I was just seeing woods and a grass opening just beyond that. There was no moon out that night, but the stars were. For a while, things seemed normal until I could start to see some type of thing dragging a deer with its insides hanging out of its stomach. This thing looked to be tall and was skinny and hairy. Its arms was long and its claws swung to its waist as it dragged the deer. It looked like a wolf walking on two legs, or like a DOGMAN thing, they say. It was hideous. Its mouth was naturally open, showing its nasty teeth. This thing released the deer on the ground and started to feed. I could hear it growl in odd vocal sounds as it ripped off the flesh and ate. It then looked up with its green eyes, seeing me peek in the corner of the tent. Not moving its eyes, it just looked at me, eating the deer, and then slowly stepped back and faded into the dark woods. I remained in fear and questioned all night, wondering if it was going to come back, but it never did. Finally, morning came and I rushed us out of the woods. My wife knew something was wrong because I didn't talk much. We made it out and haven't been back in the woods since. My wife has no idea what I saw that night, and I will never tell her. What really gets me is I was just about to go outside of the tent and walk for a moment. I wonder how things would have played out if he came and seen me out of the tent, or even worse, got to my wife when I simply could have been a few feet away. I'll never camp again now that I know what's really going on in the woods. My mom ended up moving out to the country after my father passed away years ago. She continued to stay in the house they're living in for a while until she found a nice little small house. In the back, it had several acreage and a hill that led down to a tiny little wooded creek. I was over at her house helping her move and unload when my sister, who's around 16 at this time, comes running back to the house screaming. She kept screaming that there was a tall black shape walking around on two legs around the creek, growling in her direction. Not sure what to make of it, my mother just told her not to go back there anymore. I guess after that, this thing would follow my sister around. It would look into her window at night and stare at her, and when she would get in and out of her car. When she ended up going off to college at 18, this thing seemed to disappear. I'm more intrigued about it than she is, and I guess after a while, it still scared her, but she learned to ignore it. I never saw it with my own eyes, but she just told me in depth about it. I am a believer in the unexplained and paranormal, and I believe that something attached itself to my sister. Around 2002, I was about 6 and traveling around coastal rural Ireland with my uncle. We parked the caravan on a beach underneath a cliff face, and it started to get dark. We decided to rest up for the night. I can't remember the time, but I woke up later on in the night. It was pitch black outside. The caravan was very warm and cramped, so I decided to get some fresh air. There were several others in the caravan, but they were all definitely asleep. As I got out of bed and headed towards the door, I noticed it was already open slightly, and what I seen is still seared into me this day. I seen what I can only be described as a bipedal dog or a dog man. Like many descriptions I've read, the creature was around 6 to 7 feet. It dwarfed me entirely. It had a pronounced snout, matted black fur, a human-like frame, but I believe it was wearing some kind of robe or rags. Its eyes were this iridescent, hypnotic, and terrifying yellow color, almost glowing in the darkness. I did not get a good look at its feet or legs. Now this is where the story takes a turn. The creature spoke to me. Whatever this thing was, it was trying to communicate. The creature itself was making a series of low, guttural, rhythmic growls. However, I was able to interpret these as words, whilst the entity was growling. I heard a low booming voice inside my head. I can't remember word for word what it said, but it mentioned death almost exclusively throughout the conversation. The creature didn't move, and I couldn't stop looking into its eyes for the duration of this encounter. The encounter rounded off with me breaking eye contact and curling up in a ball of hysterics. The creature left almost instantaneously, and my uncle woke up shortly afterwards. I tried to explain, but of course he didn't believe me. To go back when I was living by myself, before I met my current wife. I was stepping outside one night to take out the trash and recyclables. I have a very long driveway, probably about 200 feet if I had to guess. I keep my trash at the very end and I honestly don't mind the walk. I'm heading to my trash can, trash bag in my right hand, recyclable in the other. It's dark, but it is a clear night. I believe the moon was out, but I have no idea if it was full. As I approach my trash can, I open the lid and throw the bag in. I do the same to the recyclable, and as I'm putting on the lid to the recyclable can, I hear something large moving around in the hedges about 5 feet away. I turn my head, and through a hole in the hedges, I can see these bright, glowing, red-orange eyes. As my eyes fixate on these glowing orbs, a face and snout began to take shape along with it. My stomach dropped, and I knew I was going to die if I did not get out of there. I left my gun inside the house, so I was virtually defenseless if this thing decided to attack me. Whatever it was in my hedges, I turned around and ran back to my house and promptly locked the door. I kept my pistol close by the door just in case anything happened. That was the only time I'd ever encountered something like that. Something really strange is going on here. I'm writing this to you because I believe there's a dogman in my neighborhood area. Over the past 6 months, all the pets in the neighborhood have been vanishing left and right. I am surrounded by animal lovers and know that my surrounding neighbors have many pets. I've been asked so many times in the past couple of months if I know where their animals have gone, and I've seen all the missing pet papers. I've never been in this sort of situation before, and originally chalked all of this up to be a mountain lion. Upon further research, I ended up falling down a rabbit hole which led me to the DOGMAN phenomenon. I had read several encounters and heard things through Vic's channel about people experiencing similar things. Their pets going missing, finding animals mutilated, etc. I can't say that's entirely what this is, but I just have a feeling. For the record, I live in Ohio, and there's a big creek that runs near us about 2 or so miles away from the general neighborhood. I don't know if that helps at all, or if that makes the dogman more inclined to hang around here. I'm not so sure. I'm just looking for answers.